recording now, so just to let you guys know that. Thank you for joining our Kelp Working Group meeting. This is our fourth meeting, and we will go ahead and start off with introductions, as we always do, so keep it brief. So my name is Rebecca Flores Miller. I am an environmental scientist with Department of Fish and Wildlife, Nearshore Bay Management Program. So Kirsten, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Kirsten Ramey. I'm the Environmental Program Manager for the State Managed Finfish and Nearshore Ecosystem Program, of which the project that Rebecca works in is under my program responsibilities.
And Gina, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, then Susan?
Sure. My name is Gina Contolini. I'm a Kelp Management Extension Fellow with California Sea Grant and the Department of Fish and Wildlife.
Hello. Hello, everyone. I'm Susan Ashcraft. I'm the Marine Advisor at the California Fish and Game Commission.
Okay, let's have Doug and James introduce themselves now.
Hi, my name's Doug. I am the manager and owner of Cultured Abalone Farm in Santa Barbara, California, mechanical harvester of kelp.
Hello, everybody. My name is James Youngworth. I'm a harvester of edible seaweeds up in Del Norte and Humboldt County, California. My business is Nature Spirit Herbs. We've been in business since 1990. Thank you.
Thanks, James. And Cindy, and then Eliza.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Cindy Dawson, representing the Pew Charitable Trust.
Hi, my name is Eliza Harris, and I work as the Business Development Manager for Ocean Rainforest.
Okay, and Riata, if you could please introduce yourself. And I'm not sure if anyone else is on the call now.
Yes, this is Riata Holman, and I manage the Greater Farallones Kelp Recovery Program.
And Tom Ford, Chief Executive Officer of the Bay Foundation, Los Angeles, California.
Thanks, Tom. Anyone else that we missed? I missed. Well, hopefully Dr. Cooper will join in. So I am going to keep my my video off for the most part, just because of bandwidth. So, so thank you everybody again for joining the meeting. So we initially anticipated. Oh, if you can go to the next slide, please. You know. We initially anticipated having 3 working group meetings, but you know, we've gone on to 4. So today is the 4th and the last meeting. We are on the commission calendar to provide a recommendation to the Marine Resources Committee in July. And we'll talk more about the commission regulatory process timeline that we're on later on. And I wanted to open it up. Does anyone else have any other announcements they want to share before we move on?
Really quick, it looks like Dr. Kubler made it, so maybe she can introduce herself.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you. I did have a little trouble getting it, but now I'm here.
Great.
Janet Kubler, Cal State Northridge.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I wasn't sure if you heard, I'll just repeat that today is going to be our last meeting, and we're on the commission calendar for July. And we'll talk about the timeline for the commission calendar later on. So does anyone else have any announcements to share before we move on? Okay. So we're going to
Rebecca, it looks like there are two folks with their
I
hands
see
up. Do you
hands.
see that?
Sorry, I should look at that. Okay, how about Cindy first?
Yeah, and then James has a question after I do.
Got
I
it.
would just, this is more of a request than an announcement. I would just be hopeful that the department could open the meeting today with not just going over the timeline, but a real focus on process here. Because we're at the last meeting. And so I think it would be really helpful for all of us to understand how decisions are going to be made, who is going to make those decisions, and if there are continuing areas of disagreement, who's the final decider and how that's going to go. That would be really helpful, I think, to just set off the meeting so that we're all on the same page moving forward and we have the same expectations of what's going to come out of this meeting. Thanks.
Thank you, Cindy. And did Doug have his hand up as too, or was it James had his hand up?
I did.
Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and yeah, let's hear what you have to say, James. And then
Okay. Yeah, I just wanted to point out that I had sent an email at 12:30 p.m. to all the Bull Kelp Working Group members. It's titled Bull Kelp Working Group Comments and Corrections. Please read. I'm hoping that you got to see it, and if not, hopefully you can take a little time to look at it. I have some information I wanted to share with you all and some corrections. And then just also wanted to point out at 12:43, Andrew at Pacific Wildcraft, Andrew, who's also a Bull Kelp Working Group member and seaweed harvester, also wrote a email, Bull Kelp Working Group meeting. He sent that at 12:43 p.m. So anyway, that just wanted to point those out to you, and hopefully you can take a little time to look at them if you have not, because they're pertinent to our meeting. That's all.
yeah, thank you. So I guess Cindy, we'll go ahead and start with you first. So as far as the process and how decisions are made, so you know, the department gathers information from you know, all stakeholders. So we have this working group meeting that we're gathering information from. We also you know, have this tribal consultation that we also are gathering information from, and then just, you know, in general, other stakeholders. So we take all that information that we've gathered from folks, and then the department makes a decision as far as how to move forward. So I guess, Kirsten, do you want to add anything more to that? You probably can say a lot more eloquently than I just stated.
Well, I mean, ultimately, I think everybody may know that the commission, the Fish and Game Commission, are the decision makers. So the department will take the Bull Kelp Working Group feedback, the tribal feedback, any feedback that we have received during committee meetings and Fish and Game Commissions, and incorporate that into a regulatory proposal that gets presented to the Fish and Game Commission. And that formal process, once it gets initiated at the commission, that formal process still allows for stakeholder input to be provided and received by the commission for them to incorporate into their decision making. And you know, I would defer to Susan to talk more specifically about how department staff, you know, capture comments and incorporate those into the administrative record for commission. But yeah, so we are in more of a stakeholder engagement process at the moment, and we are proposing to start the formal process with the Fish and Game Commission by getting on the July MRC agenda, which then the Marine Resources Committee would then, if in agreement, would then make a recommendation to the full commission in August to start the rulemaking calendar, essentially, which would then get triggered in October, the following public meeting. So Susan, I don't know if you want to add to that anymore about the formal commission process.
Yeah, I think, we can check back in about this at the end of today's meeting and when we see where the work group is at. The MRC is expecting to hear a report out of how this work group has, where both the process and where you've arrived. I know there seems to be some uncertainty, and so I think it would help the MRC chairs if there are areas of uncertainty that or areas that maybe they're uncertain right now, but it might be more it might necessitate being addressed through the management plan. That those could be flagged, because I think some of the areas of uncertainty are very legitimate, but they're not necessarily something that delaying month or 2 months is going to answer. And so we'll see where we get. The committee has experienced where there is some areas of convergence, some areas of divergence, and if they are comfortable with where you're at largely, then they would put a recommendation to schedule it. If they are not, if they think it's not ripe, they might send something back. So right now we're moving forward with an expectation that they'll have something to recommend to the commission. And I don't know if that's specific enough for what you all were looking for, but it's the MRC where, sometimes they'll have debates over the areas of divergence, and that'll help them shape how they report out to the full commission.
Did that, thank you, Kirsten and Susan, for clarifying that process. Cindy, did that clarify your questions?
Yeah, it did for me. I don't know if the harvesters have anything else, but that works for me. Thanks.
Okay. Did anyone else have any questions on that process? And then James, I did see your emails, your email and Andrew's email that came in. If there are, I haven't had a chance to fully digest that, so I'm sorry, but I did briefly look it over. If there are, that areas of agreement divergence document, if there are things that, are incorrect on there, please let us know so we make sure to address those. I know the one item that that you had stated was not in agreement, that actually was on the divergence section, but if anyone does see anything that needs to be addressed in there, please let us know so we can change that.
Okay, I'll take a look at it again.
Yeah, and like I said, I didn't have time to fully digest both of the emails, so I'm not really prepared to respond to all those today. If you have anything specific, we can talk about that if you want right now, but I just, I don't have those. I didn't have time to look at them all yet.
Yes, well, I think I could address these different issues as we get to that part in the meeting, and that'll be a little more pertinent rather than to run a bunch of stuff by you right now.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you. So today we are going to, we have this agreement and divergence document that we're going to be talking about and later on. And then we're going to do before that, we'll do a brief review of the department's approach that we previously discussed. And we're going to also reconsider or further consider the Del Norte and Humboldt County approach, and also talk about the sunset date for proposed regulations. And then we are going to, after we talk about the areas of disagreement and agreement and divergence, then we'll talk about harvest methods and harvest logs. And can you go to the next slide? And then we'll talk about the harvester license, the proposal that has been brought forth by the Intertribal Sinking Wilderness Council, and then wrap up next steps. So that's talking about the commission calendar. I know that's already been discussed. So we'll just briefly go over those dates again. So if we go on the next slide. So we're going to do a brief review of the department's proposed regional approach. And so this is based off of the current status of bull kelp using the satellite imagery data that we discussed during the previous two meetings. We do have the canopy data through the end of the year now for 2020, and that's at the end of the document that I sent you, the PDF of the presentation. So it does not show, shows no significant recovery of canopy in the most recent data. So as a reminder, the satellite imagery data available does not distinguish between giant and bull kelp. So we can't use that data set for south of San Francisco because the two species coexist in some of those areas. So the proposed changes for the regional approach is going to have, will have a sunset date of potentially 3 to 5 years until the kelp restoration management plan has been completed. And we're going to talk more about that in the next slides. So based on the best available data on the proposed changes, we are proposing to prohibit all bull kelp harvest in Mendocino and Sonoma counties, regardless of their intended use. Precautionary approach would be due to the significant declines of bull kelp in those counties, and the prohibit a bull kelp harvest in Marin County because of concern of a harvest shift to historically low kelp county that has not experienced harvest effort in the past. Next slide. So none of that is new. That's all same stuff. And then also just continuing on, we have proposed to impose a hiatus on accepting new kelp lease applications for the 3 lease-only beds for Mendocino, Humboldt, and Del Norte. And that would be an administrative change, not regulatory. And then one change that we previously proposed was the regional approach that we want to talk today, is instead of limiting the number of bull kelp harvesters in Humboldt and Del Norte counties to the 2 existing companies that harvest in those 2 counties, to instead consider proposing a total harvest limit based on the current regulations for bull kelp take and edible use, and with what has been historically harvested in those counties, which would be 4 tons a year. So the department is not currently recommending a limit on the number of permits, but we're open to recommendation from the industry on how to allocate that overall quota. So this limit would require department to have like real-time reporting of the data to monitor the quota. And a benefit would be to continue to allow take in Del Norte and Humboldt County as requested by the harvesters. Which also another request by the harvesters is to allow others to shift harvest due to that closure in Sonoma, Mendocino, and Marin counties. So we wanted to hear everyone's thoughts on that that potential change. What do you think about having essentially a harvest limit and allowing folks to go into that area instead of limiting the number of folks to 2?
Let's see.
Yep, I see James's hand, so, and then Doug.
Okay, should I go ahead now?
Yep.
Okay. So let's see. So there's a couple issues here. First of all, to start with, I mean, the data shows, although 2019 was a bust year in Del Norte County, overall since 2014, our average canopy levels have been higher than they were before 2014. So I'm not sure why I see a need to for such a stringent limit of 4 tons. In terms of what's there, what I see there, that represents a small fraction of a percent of what I can see from the shore. So there's, as far as the 2 other main seaweed harvesters that I know of that are harvesting bull kelp, Andrew and Terry, they both have quite clearly expressed that there's no way they're going to come up my way to harvest. It's just it's just too far away. And so that's, I asked them about that, and that's what they said. It's just it's a what do you want to say? It's a really from the time you harvest to the time you have it dried out, there's a pretty short window before you start getting loss of quality and spoilage. So I don't think that that's appealing to them. That was my take on that. And then secondly, currently there's 2 harvesters up in my area, and so that under the way that you had it proposed before, it was allowing 8 tons total. I don't really see a need to limit it to 4 at all. I mean, hopefully some of you will get to see that soon. And then the other one is that this would potentially allow new harvesters to come in who never have harvested, who are new permit holders to come in and harvest. And it seems to me that in a time when we're trying to, if you're going to try to limit the total take, it would make sense to try to also limit the impact on the existing businesses. And that just doesn't make sense to allow new people to come in and harvest when you have you're proposing another Derby style harvest situation that's completely destabilizing to our industry. So that's why I disagree with that. I personally would not have a issue with Andrew or Terry coming up my way if there was not going to impact my own ability to harvest. But if there's going to be a Derby style harvest limit proposal, that just doesn't make sense at all. That's all.
Hey, Rebecca, this is Kirsten. Before we go on, I think we need to clarify something that I heard James say. I thought he mentioned that the current take is 8 tons per year, but that.
No, yeah, it's not.
Yeah.
No, wait a second. It was 4,000 pounds per permit, not 4 tons. Okay.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
it's currently at 4 tons with me and the other harvester.
Yeah, it's
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
2 tons
thanks.
per license holder. Correct. Thank you for
Thank you.
clarifying that.
Thanks for that.
So yeah, the original proposal was the 4 tons, which was the 2 license holders combined. Okay. Doug, do you, I see your hands up next, and then Cindy.
Hi, Rebecca. Hi, everybody. Thank you. I think, you know, it's a tricky situation, but I have some concerns with the approach here, and that are a little bit different than James and than James's concerns. And in some regards, we kind of diverge, but in some other regards, we kind of come to a similar conclusion. I'm concerned and continue to be concerned that the limits that the work group has seen kind of come across the proposals are based not on like a sustainable biological yield, but are instead being proposed based on historical take. And that's been the case in the proposals and the presentations that we've seen since the beginning of this proposal discussion. From the beginning, we've been wanting to advocate for a quantitative approach. And we have, you know, and we've sort of made a lot of progress as a group discussing where there are data shortcomings, where we have data that already exists that has been accepted by the commission, referring here to the 2003 CEQA. So we get to these, you know, conversions of acreage to tonnage, you know, tonnage per acre, and then the missing puzzle piece is, well, what's the yield for, you know, for 1 acre or X number of tons? How much can be taken? How much is going back into the ecological system and sustaining the ecological functions of a kelp bed? How much of it is just like lost and drifted away? I guess that has ecological function in its own regard. How much of it is drifting up on the beach? Yet a separate bucket of ecological function. What's the amount that can be taken? And that's where we want to be able to create a model where we say, well, how much, you know, because the thing that I'm concerned about is, as a set of departmental recommendations, the department is kind of proposing this in an economic vacuum. You guys are your own stakeholder. And so the hiatus on licensees or limiting to 4 tons a year, you cut yourself out of the economic ebb and flow that comes from a well-managed sustainable resource. If there is a fundamental sustainable take model that says, this is how big the beds are, this is how many tons that represents, and therefore this is the harvestable take for these counties or for these AKBs for this season, then, and let's say that that's 100 tons, right? Just to use a round number, then we can say, okay, for the existing licensees, it exceeds the 4,000 pound per licensee unit. There's no restriction. Oh, in a down year, it goes, there's 10 licensees, so there's 40,000 pounds of allowable take. And we've decided that based on the ecology, there's only 30,000 pounds available, and everybody proportionally goes down in the amount that they're allowed to take. These, to me, represent, and I'm just throwing these out as like spitballing kind of ways to approach it, but these represent quantitative models based on economic function. I really, really strongly resist using the last trailing 5 years of take as because you're cutting yourself off at the knees as the department in terms of the growth of a sustainable industry. If you make a hiatus on new licensees, then you're making a hiatus on new people who are vested in sustainable management and acting as the department's partners. You're cutting yourself off for the possibility for revenue growth through, and I realize here that the revenue growth from licensing and royalties on seaweeds is very, very low in the overall departmental scheme of things. But it's an arbitrary thing that's completely decoupled from the actual take and the potential take and the responsiveness to ecological conditions. And that's where I've been hoping that this work group was going to go from the beginning. So I'll turn it over to Cindy, but those are my comments.
Yeah, and I just, before Cindy speaks, I just want to say, You're right, Doug. I mean, there is a lot of information that we don't know about and that we need to know as far as how much can sustainably taken. We also need to know, sustainable harvest methods. When it comes to bulk health, there's a lot that we don't know. And so, as we had started this working group, we had acknowledged that we aren't going to be able to have all the answers, at this moment. But we will have a management plan. We will have a kelp restoration and management plan that will start to address those topics. And so, again, that is why we are, when it comes to this regional approach, we are putting forth a end date, and we'll talk about the end date in the next slide, because we need to have some more discussions on that, to allow for that management plan to determine what is sustainable, what are those thresholds. So,
well, I would hope that that can be part of the output of the work group, is to indicate to the commission that this is where we need this to go for it to be effective, right? Not to just use these relatively or completely arbitrary 4-ton per year figures and content ourselves with that. This is the opportunity for the work group to provide direction, and a conversation within the department and commission dynamic to inform the commission on where the department feels the gaps are and what the priorities need to be for the model to be tighter and more effective. So I would hope that that can be if we don't have the means to create that model now, then at least it needs to be illustrated as a priority going forward. Because this hamster wheel of just saying, I don't know, let's just close it. I mean, it's killing us. I mean, we've got to evolve beyond that.
right. Yeah. And I agree that we need to, it's, acknowledging what the data needs are. And, and that's part of that was in that agreement and divergence document. The agreement was that we need to have some more studies on sustainable methods of harvest. And actually, and also in the enhanced status report, when that comes out, it has a really good overview of areas of research need for kelp. So thank you. Cindy, I think you're next.
Sure. Yeah, I just wanted to strongly agree with some of the points both James and Doug made. I'll start with Doug's and go backwards to James. Well, perhaps maybe a little bit of framing about how we're thinking about this, that the recommendations coming out of this group is an interim set of regulations responding to existing conditions. And it's like not the long-term goal, whatever comes out of this. So one, we're thinking about it in this way, like whatever happens now, we fully anticipate and fully will be advocating for that to change in the future, because we feel, as it seems that Doug does, that tying all take to the status of the resource is really where we need to go collectively, regardless of the market where this ends up. But making our harvest limits tied directly to the resource. And again, we're in this really unique situation with the resource that comparatively, we have a pretty high ability relatively cheaply to monitor in space and time in a way that we don't for most marine resources. So I just want to strongly agree with Doug in that, our long-term goal should be, as he stated, which is like we should be tying the take to what is sustainable for the resource and the conditions on the ground for the resource. We're not there yet, but I do really feel like we should continue to state that as a goal, and the department should actively state that as a goal as you start to move through this fishery management process, and inevitably the regulations that will come with that, the more comprehensive set of regulations, perhaps a harvest control rule that would come with the fisheries management plan, which is out in the future. I also wanted to just speak to some of the things that James said about a derby fishery, and potentially by having just a sort of real-time harvest limit, a derby fishery sort of setup, you do potentially open this up to other licensee holders who haven't been in these areas before. I think we all agree that these areas are in varying levels of distress, but there is distress. And so setting up something where, you have the records to know who is depending on this for their business right now. And it seems to me that you should use that information to develop a process that specifically speaks to those folks who have been in. And that's common in fisheries, that, people who have landings, like I think 3 years actually is a fine number. If you guys want to go back 5 years, fine. And then specifically saying that, folks who had landings in these particular areas where you're going to have land take in whatever 3 of the last 5 years, they are allowed to, harvest in these areas. I think the derby style fishery is not a great approach, and it sends the wrong message, which is that, these areas are under distress and we're proceeding with caution. Thanks.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to speak?
Sure.
Okay.
I don't know. Did Janet raise her hand first?
I think it was simultaneous. You go ahead, James.
Okay. Okay. Well, I agree with what Doug and Cindy are talking about in terms of tying, that all of this arbitrary numbers are just that, and that's not really it's not adaptive management. It's not effective management. It has nothing to do with what's actually going on out in the water. And so I agree that that's what we need to do. We need to figure out biomass to canopy data and all of that sort of thing. And I agree that the harvest should be tied to the status of the resource. That's just elementary. Hopefully, that's an elementary basic in management. And so anyway, I was just agreeing with with those statements. Although I'm cautious about tying, the status of the edible harvest to the status of the beds until something changes, because as I pointed out in the letter, that if we were to just assign the current status of the bed to the edible harvest, it would basically shut down the entire edible harvest permanently, unless the status of the administrative kelp beds are changed first. So anyway, that was a point I wanted to make.
Can I clarify?
Anyway.
Can I make sure I understand? I think when you're talking about the status of the administrative kelp beds, that you're not meaning the actual, like, how the kelp canopy is looking in those beds. You're talking about whether it's closed or open or lease only, correct?
Correct. It should be tied to the resource, not to the current status of the bed, as far as edible harvest
The
goes.
administrative status and closed lease only. Okay, great. That's what I thought you meant, but I just wanted to make sure it was clear for others as well. Okay. Dr. Kupler?
Okay, I absolutely agree that the harvest limits should be tied to what that population can support, and what happened in the past, it is almost irrelevant to what is biologically useful for that population and protecting that population over time. That tying it to previous harvests, I know it's convenient, but I don't think it makes any sense in terms of sustainability, which is agreeing with what Doug and Cindy just said. I'm just throwing my support also behind having the status well, the harvest limits tied to what's actually happening in the beds. And following up on that, I think that the data that we've seen for Humboldt and Del Norte counties does not actually show that those populations are in distress, or that those populations are in decline in any way. If you look, when based on the data that's been shown in this working group for those places in the far north. So I think it's also very important to keep the scale of the regional approach at the same scale at which the population dynamics are happening, so that there is, I mean, we have seen that there's been big changes in Mendocino and Sonoma County, but not big changes in the far north. Thanks.
Thank you. I think, Cindy, did you have your hand up again? Or was that
Yeah,
me?
sorry, y'all. I just forgot to make one other point. My first time, I had it in my notes. I skipped it. Sorry. So I did put it in the chat, but I absolutely agree with Dr. Kubler and everyone that you know, the historical take is not tied to biological conditions on the ground, but in fisheries management, you know, when we are in potentially a data poor situation, which we're not exactly up there, you know, we are in a data poor situation for the level of sustainable take, right? We still need some questions answered around that. So specifically to that, you know, using average take over recent years can be a proxy in the interim, you know, which is kind of what the department is proposing. But, you know, I would like to see, you know, we look at average take over the last 5 years or something like that, as opposed to just saying we have 2 licensees and they could take their maximum. You know, I think that would be something to potentially look at. But again, you know, I want to just emphasize this is an interim approach, and this should not be thought of as the long-term way that we manage kelp. It should be tied to the resource. And I also want to just agree with James again to say that, you know, to make this work, it's going to take a major overhaul of the regulations, and the designation of kelp beds would change moving forward if all take would be tied to the status of each of the beds, which that spatial management backbone, I think, makes a lot of sense to move forward. Okay, I'll be quiet now. Thanks.
Cindy, I just wanted to see if you could clarify when you were talking about you would prefer the average take over the last 5 years. Were you referring the average overall take, or so you would have a limit, like an annual limit based off that, or were you basing it off of like for each specific harvester it would be their average take? I assumed you meant average take for the bed in its entirety, or that county in its entirety.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would be something that you would, you know, you guys could just quickly do the numbers on and kind of look at all of those things that you just said and what would make the most sense. But again, I think what we need to be, I mean, I think we should just state the goal that we're trying to achieve based on the data we have on the population in that area. The take that is coming out of there appears to be sustainable. And so if we're going to move that forward in the interim, we just need to take an approach that would allow us to do that in the least impactful way to both the resource and the harvester.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Kubler?
Yes, you know, going back to that use of the historical take is really based on the idea that that the resource is relatively constant, and the main impact on the resource is the take, right? That it's a sustainable harvest because the take stays about the same. But this is not at all the case for the bull kelp, because there's no evidence that the take has any effect on the population, and the dynamics in the population are due to the climate. rather than the climate and the ecological climate of the invertebrates in the system. So it's really a very different system where the variation in the population size from year to year is huge because it's annual plant, and the harvest is really not driving the size of the population like it would be for a targeted fishery where you could possibly fish it below some sustainable level. What we're really kind of need to turn this around and say, like, given that the population is bouncing up and down in ways that we can't really predict, and the climate is continuing to change, at what point does this currently unimportant level of take matter to the population, right? It requires a different way, I think, of looking at it than looking at it like a fish species. So that's just something to add into what it is we're looking to recommend down the road in terms of an adaptive management model. Just a comment.
Rebecca, if I could just jump in very quickly, I think those kinds of upfront statements in the work group report would be extremely helpful for the commissioners to be able to say, to acknowledge these types of issues up front. Particularly, I think this group wants to be sensitive to the concern that harvesters have that they're being painted as villains, whereas their practices are intentionally sustainable and proactive in many, many cases. At any rate, to make that point that Janet just made, as well as to acknowledge that these are a temporary way to hit pause until there is a management structure that would be have more refined tools.
Completely agree. Okay, I see some hands up. I'm looking at the time. It's 1:52, but I still see hands up. So if anyone has anything more they want to talk about on this agenda item, let's go ahead and do that, and then we can move on. And just go ahead and just speak. I don't want to call out on everybody. If I see there's a few hands.
I think it was me, James, and then Tom, maybe, is I think the order. And then maybe somebody else as well. I just wanted to push back a little bit on what Dr. Kugler said, in that if you look at the big fishery collapses, certainly there are a lot of drivers to that, and environmental drivers are a big part of that as well. So, fishing is or harvest is a stressor, and depending on the species and the life history of the species and the biology, kind of like, how much each of those drivers affects a collapse and the population is totally variable. So I totally agree that this is a unique species, like it's annual. We know there's crazy geographical and temporal variation because of the life history. But I do want to say that, again, any kind of looking back and using harvest should not be what we're trying to move forward as we're thinking about an overall adaptive management approach. What I'm advocating is that given the situation is right now, and that there's going to be some interim take before we have the long-term adaptive management situation that really ties take to the biological state of the species we're talking about. I think that it could be used effectively as a proxy, as a short-term approach to come up with a systematic way to think about harvest before we have the overhauled system, which I think we're all agreeing we need to have at some point. So I just wanted to jump in there. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'll say something next. Well, thank you very much, Janet, for pointing out what you pointed out. What you're saying is accurate. in my own case, we harvest, our general purpose is that we harvest what we think we can sell in the next year, and maybe a little bit more than that, because that we just don't want to have, you know, too much seaweed in storage at any one time. So our harvest is market based. It has nothing to do with how much is out there, except in the case of when we've had the bust years, which we've had a 3 or 4 in the last 20 years. It's just part of the big cycle that we see. And so when I see 2 or 3 years of abundance in one particular reef where there's like a lot of shade, you know, dense bull kelp, I typically see a bust year. And so I in 2019 there was a bust year, and so since I harvest the overwintered stuff in the spring of 2020, which was last spring, I didn't harvest any because there wasn't enough to support my harvest. Now, that is the only way that my harvest is tied into the abundance of the resource. It's because of self-restraint during bust years. And so if we were going to try to set tight limits on my harvest during good years, what I did in the previous year, the year before the bust year, I was expecting that bust year, so I harvested twice as much as I usually do because I expected there to be a bust year. So if there was a tight limit on the amount I could harvest, then I'd be much more tempted to try to harvest during a bust year. That does not make any sense at all.
Right.
So I just wanted to point out that again, to say that to try to use a 5-year trailing stop has nothing to do with the state of the resource, and that the satellite data clearly shows that there's no need to put any limits whatsoever up in Del Norte County where I'm at. That's all.
Hey, Rebecca, can I just make a quick clarification?
Yes.
I mean, ultimately, what the department is proposing right now for Humboldt and Del Norte counties is to not change current regulations. So this wouldn't put a limit on you in particular, James, because it's still allowing for 4 tons per year, which is what the current regulations allow. What the department is asking the stakeholder group to help recommend to us is whether or not that 4 tons per year should be limited to 2 permittees, the way it has been in the most recent years. There's been 2 permittees operating in Humboldt and Del Norte, or, you know, essentially that's kind of establishing what we call a limited entry fishery, or if that 4 tons per year should be open up to 4 permittees, you know, how to allocate that 4 tons per year. But given the most recent canopy data that we have, it's, you know, it's showing that the bull kelp canopy in Del Norte County is still at a fairly low level. 2020, there was no significant difference from 2019. So we are being precautionary for Humboldt and Del Norte counties, not knowing whether or not we are needing to anticipate a similar decline that we've seen in in Mendocino and Sonoma counties. So that's where we're considering just limiting it at the existing regs and asking the working group and the permittees whether or not we should also, in addition to that, limit the number of permits. Hopefully that makes sense and I didn't just ramble on.
And I just wanted to clarify the existing regs of 2-ton limit per for the license holder.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I could try to quickly. I know Tom Ford's got his hand up and that, but I'll just. So thanks for making that clarification. And I still, I mean, I certainly like I'm assuming you would be limiting it to allowing other currently licensed harvesters to come up to Del Norte County. If it's allowing people who are currently unlicensed to buy one and start harvesting up there and take part of that 4 tons, that makes no sense whatsoever. It's completely destabilizing to the industry. Allowing my colleagues to come up into my area, for one, I have the option of doing that already. I can let them harvest under my permit, and so that option exists already. I should point out, but I don't think that they're interested. You know, I spoke with Andrew on this at length. I haven't actually talked to Terry about it, but I can't imagine her wanting to drive 6 or 8 hours to get a couple 100 pounds of bull kelp. It just doesn't make sense. That's all for now.
So James, I have a question. So you're concerned with new harvesters in that area, even though, I mean, we haven't had any new harvesters, but so you're concerned with that. So I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes,
Okay.
and at the same time, I know this. Some of you are going to get to see the kind of canopy, the amount of bull kelp that's currently up in my area, and hopefully this will become a moot point once you see the amount. Once some people in the department get to see how much bull kelp's happening up in my harvest areas. I don't understand why the canopy data isn't showing it yet. I just don't understand. So I don't see the need for the limit at all. If you're going to limit it to 4 tons per year, I don't know. I can't speak for the other harvester. I have the option of inviting Terry or Andrew up to my area and harvest some of my take limit, I guess I would say. But I certainly wouldn't be very happy about someone new coming into the industry and taking it, if you know what I'm saying, because that's just that doesn't make any sense at all.
I'm hoping this is a good time for me to jump in. I just first I wanted to say all the material that I reviewed heading into the meeting today, thought really faithfully and accurately captures the extent of our conversations over the last few meetings. So I think that is good. I'm focusing on the amount of agreement that you've heard from the other folks on the working group thus far. And I think my interest stems from Cindy asking some clarifying questions about process. And then I think Doug furthering that with a little more specificity about how some of these recommendations would be memorialized so we don't lose them as part of something that was part of this interim management strategy or not part of this interim management strategy, and that somehow we get some type of assurance on at least a mechanism for how the status of the stocks are reflected in a sustainable approach towards their harvest. So I'm sorry to have to do that in a summarial fashion right now and then jump off, but I have another meeting to get to. But I hope that those comments are well received.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for joining us. Okay, so I think I don't see any other hands up, so if we can move on now. Although okay, yeah, I think we should go ahead and just move on at this point. So if we can go to the next, thanks, Gina. So we also wanted to discuss the end date for the regional approach further. So as we previously discussed, those proposed changes, the regional approach, are going to have a sunset date of potentially 3 to 5 years, or until the kelp restoration and management plan has been completed. So we want to propose a vote to the working group members, and I realize Tom just got off. So but for an end date to the regulation, end date for these interim, essentially interim regulations. So it would be 3 to 5 years. It would be the majority rule, vote rules. But before we go on to that voting, we wanted to be transparent and for you to consider that if the kelp restoration and management plan is not implemented by the end date of this regional approach we're discussing, there would be 4 options. So what we kept talking about previously was the first option, which is the regulations pertaining to the regional approach would revert back to as they previously were. But there are other options to also consider. And so we want to bring those forth now. And one is an extension of the regional approach until the kelp restoration and management plan is completed. The next one is a new regulation package with new information gathered during that time frame, whatever that time frame is, or utilize the information compiled in that draft management plan to inform the proposed regulations. And then the last one would be if the kelp rebounds before there's a management plan, there could be a potential for another regulatory review. So considering those options, we wanted that those are all options that may happen. And we don't know at this time what those options, if any, which of those options would happen. But we're just trying to be transparent. We wanted to know your what you think your vote is for an end date in the regulations for this regional approach, whether it's 3 years or 5 years. And I see we have some hands up. So I'm not sure if it was Doug first or James, but it was one of you.
Go ahead, Doug.
I mean, I can't disagree with this approach more strongly. You guys have to go look. Like, we've had the windiest, most upwelling driven winter and spring in recent memory. Like, the kelp is marching right now in a way that, to the idea that this closure on Sonoma and Mendocino is going to go 3 to 5 years before we're even looking at a reversion is, I mean, if I could vote, if my vote can be expressed in all caps so that it's clear that I'm, yelling. I mean, you need to have a quantitative relief valve. If we're doing this closure, it needs to have as the comments that I submitted via email after our last work group. I mean, if there's one topic that's the distillation of my feelings on this program, if you're closing something, it's got to have a quantitative relief valve when the canopy is clearly back above that threshold. Then the harvest can resume. If we kick the closure on Sonoma and Mendocino 3 to 5 years, and then it's a big maybe, it's just, we all know how this goes. It's just I'll stop because I'll lose my composure. I can't support this in any way, shape, or form.
Thank you, Doug. James?
Okay. Well, yeah, I was going to say something very similar to what Doug was just expressed. Just based on what I'm looking at out there, and I was down on a trip down to Mendocino, down to Fort Bragg just a couple weeks ago, and I saw a lot of bull kelp down there. I saw from one vista point, I saw an area where I probably saw what I would estimate to be about 100 tons from one place. And so if, and I don't know how that place was last year or the year before, but I saw a lot of bull kelp, and I see that, and I just want to, based on the data, we usually see the difference between the tops and the bottoms in these fluctuations in a period of 1 to 2 years, from bottom to top and bottom to top, 1 to 2 years on these cycles. So 3 to 5 years, we could have a boom and a bust and a boom and a bust in that same amount of time before we even get to look at any of this stuff. That just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And so the very minimum should be a yearly review of and looking at the new data coming in of the bull kelp canopy. That's all.
Okay, Cindy?
Yeah, I just, I'd just like to make a process comment and then also just respond to like the conditions on the ground that I've also been seeing being in the water up and down the coast as well. I think it's really hard to give us the option to vote for a regional approach when we haven't. I mean, we don't even know what the regional approach is. I mean, we know what you're proposing, but you haven't packaged that up and say, this is what we're moving forward. And perhaps it's just a terminology thing, because to me, I mean, of course, we have administrative kelp beds and we know there's high variability temporally and spatially. So there always should be a regional approach, and there has been in the past. I mean, there's right now in the regulations, there's a difference in the regulations where there's bull kelp versus, bull kelp dominant versus macrocystis. So I would just like to point out sort of the process issue of asking us for a vote on something when we don't even know what we're voting on or what the regulation package is. And also, I was wondering perhaps, I've kind of forgot the time constraints around emergency regulations and how often they have to be reviewed. I think it's really short, which doesn't, I don't think we need to be reviewing these regulations every 3 months. But I'm just wondering if somebody could talk about potential different options of how you could move a regulation package forward and be cognizant of just the dynamism in the system. I would just say, also areas up the coast that I've been to, looking at over the last 20 years, I thought it was a dead whale in some places because there's kelp in areas that I've never seen a kelp canopy. And there's also just here in Santa Cruz, there's, we're all getting whiplash surfing because there's kelp in places that there's never been before. So all I'm saying is, I don't know what the quantitative side of that is. And I know we need to look across the whole population, but we do need to be realistic about the dynamism of this species in particular. And I think our regulatory approach should try as best we can to be precautionary, while still, also realizing that things can change relatively quickly. We certainly are supportive of, the things that we outlined on an April 24th email that there's been some discussion about. But, pinning it to an arbitrary time, I mean, there's part of me that would like to just say that we pin it to the adoption of the kelp fisheries management plan, and then everybody just really pressure you guys to get it done. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Cindy. And I did want to state, so when we talk about the regional approach, it's like everything we have just discussed. So that is the what you could call the package, at this time. So that's what we're asking for. And as far as emergency regulations, I think Susan would be the best person to answer that question.
I'm sorry, in terms of which part of the regulations question? Oh, in terms of how we can structure it in the regulations?
Susan, I'm just wondering if you could just review the timeline. I feel like that when we do emergency regulations, they're on a very short timeline, like they only last like 90 days and then they have to be reviewed. And the most you could extend them is maybe 6 months or a year. I'm just wondering if you could talk about that to see if that may be a mechanism that people can get behind, or that the timing doesn't really work out.
So I think you're talking about a potential pathway if the group was to explore if the group could choose to do 1 year at a time. And then if there were concerns that would prompt continuation of a closure, then that would need to be done through an emergency regulation, because otherwise the rulemaking process is way too lengthy to allow for that kind of dexterity in the moment. So with emergency regulations, there is a requirement, unless it's for human health and safety, it has to be for there has to be an emergency of imminent risk to the natural resource. And the way that Office of Administrative Law approaches it is they don't see it as a way, they have safeguards in place to avoid having it used as a way to get around the rulemaking process and the public engagement process. So when that that condition is demonstrated by the agency, then emergency regulations can be adopted without a public comment period. It's 5-day notice, I think it is. Maybe it's 10 days. I'm sorry, I don't remember exactly without looking it up. And it's generally in place for 90 days for periods of time that can be renewed up to a year. The only reason they can be renewed is if the agency is able to show that they're working towards a regular rulemaking that will have the public review process in place. So similar to what Doug said about triggers, unless there are mechanisms or triggers defined in the regulation that would allow to open or keep closed, it would be difficult to do without subsequent rulemaking. So that would be a driver in the timeline. And we've had experience with that with the abalone closure, recreational fishing closure. And so there are some examples to look at there to see how it worked. But I think we did 1 year, and then the commission decided to go with 2 years, and then the commission decided to make it longer. So there is an option, but it does require a rulemaking to get on the calendar for the subsequent year to ensure that it could be reviewed in time to make a decision and get the rulemaking through.
So Susan, based on your summary there, my interpretation is that emergency rulemaking is not necessarily an appropriate course of action for this topic.
That's right. That's right.
Rebecca, I didn't realize when you were talking about a vote that you were talking about the entire regional package. I kind of want to echo a little bit of what Cindy said, in that I'm a little uncomfortable with the idea of approaching this from a vote perspective, and that's not a political calculation of who I think would vote for what. That's a process. That's a process comment. I would vote against it, and I think that would be unfortunate, because my reasoning would be that there's just not enough specificity. There's not enough quantitative approach in what we have articulated so far. But I think that would unfortunately end up voting against elements of the package that we've discussed so far that I could live with. So, there are elements to what we've discussed in regional management temporary approaches that I think we can find consensus on, but there are elements that I think are largely missing from what we would need to move forward. My strong reaction to this slide, though, is I think James said it best by saying, like, 3 to 5 years does not match with the nature of the resource that we're trying to manage here. 3 to 5 years could reflect, two full boom and bust cycles, as he said, and that's not gaining us anything. I don't see that there's room for that, but I do think that there's questions that we still need to answer. There's questions of there's administrative processing and reporting questions that we need to answer too. And I don't think we've been specific enough yet in these work group meetings and sort of hammering out some of these details in a way that creates a package that simultaneously where simultaneously the commercial interests, accept that there's a resource that needs some management attention, and that we also make a commitment to a quantitative approach that is a positive for all stakeholders. And I don't think we've made the steps necessary to approach any of us being able to make a solid thumbs up, thumbs down assessment at this point.
So what it is the reason why the sunset date of 3 to 5 years that we proposed, at the on the onset of this, is because it will take some time for that kelp restoration and management plan to be developed. And we will have more knowledge on how to sustainably manage the fishery with that kelp restoration management plan. So that's why we had put in the 3 to 5 years. So that's where that comes from. And then as far as what we were asking for specifically, and I'm sorry, I might not have been clear, or maybe I'm just misunderstanding you, but is that we were asking if there was an option, we were putting forth an option, because we don't, for that end date in the regulations, whether or not you wanted that end date, do you prefer that end date to have to be 3 years away from when the regulations are implemented for the regional approach, or 5 years away? So that's what we were asking for. But we also added in those options that what happens if the management plan is not in place within those 3 to 5 years. So I hope that is clear, and please let me know if it's not.
I have a question. So that I keep seeing this word recovery, and I keep seeing that, like, well, we don't have a definition of what recovery means, and the word is recovery is being used widely to justify, lack of recovery is being used widely to justify limits and closures. But this is just rhetoric if there's no definition of the term recovery. And so before considering any harvest closures, I would suggest that the department define what does the word recovery mean. And so like I did hear someone say that the recovery means the 34-year average of the bull kelp canopy area data. The question would be, like, what is recovery, and how are we going to know when we get there? Like, I don't want to sign my name onto the dotted line, so to speak, if someone else can determine what the word recovery means. That's again, we don't know what we're voting for here. And then along the same lines, what does the current percentage, like what does the current canopy data tell us? Where are we at in relation to that 34-year average? What is the current satellite data from the last quarter measured? Like, how is that? What percentage of the average is that? That seems like a baseline question that should be at the foundation of any of this. That's all.
Thank you. So yeah, no, you're right. We haven't defined recovery, but when we look at the historical record of bull kelp in the North Coast, I shouldn't say in the North Coast, I'm sorry, Mendocino, Sonoma, those counties have experienced that crash in 2014, and they have not gone back up to historic levels. We did provide, we do have, I wonder if this might be a good, well, towards the end of this presentation, Gina did update our the kelp canopy graphs that that includes the last quarter. So she has the data for the last quarter of 2020. So she was able to update those graphs to reflect all of 2020. But when she's looking at that data set, she's picking out the quarter that has the maximum canopy. So, and she's using that. Correct, Gina? Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yes, so the satellite images, the data is in the form of quarterly canopy cover. And in the figures I'd been showing, and we have at the end of this presentation, it's showing the maximum quarter canopy data per year, divided up in different ways by region or by county.
And Mendocino and Sonoma counties are not showing any change.
Well, we should probably just look at it before we, like we said, we haven't defined recovery. They still might look low to some people, but they are probably different. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. They're not the exact same number. But in this discussion, I don't want to now put some qualifiers on it. We should just look at it later if we have time.
Yeah.
But I believe you're given this presentation, right, Rebecca? So everyone can look at it in that email that you sent out. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. So it's there. And thank you, Gina. But yes, everyone does have that. And as Gina stated, if we have time towards the end of presentation, we will scoot on over to it. Okay. Oh, James, is your hand up again?
No.
Okay, got it. All right. So maybe if we can. I'm sorry. Oh, Susan.
Yeah. Okay. Actually, I can probably put my hand down. The tenor of the conversation shifted, and so if I think of it later, I'll bring it back up.
Okay. So it's about 2:30. Do folks want to take a quick break, a quick 10-minute break, and then we will start up again? Or how are folks feeling? I know that I'm going to probably want a break, but I don't need one right now. So how are folks
I think
feeling?
Doug had his hand up. Did you have a comment about what we were just talking about, Doug?
No, I was just, no, I do not. I was going to say I prefer to soldier on and try and motor through as much of this as we can.
Okay. All right. Does everyone else agree? Okay. Okay, thanks. Sorry, one moment.
Should I go to the next slide? Rebecca, you're muted.
Yes, please. Sorry. My dog needed to be let out of the room, and if I did not let her out, she would start barking. So I didn't want a barking dog. So you all, we did send to you last night document we talked about earlier, this areas of agreement and divergence. So when we, when we started the Bull Kelp Working Group, we provided a draft roadmap to everybody that contained the working group's goal, which was collaborative development. And that was to manage bull kelp through the regional approach and consider specific harvest methods with a purpose to facilitate effective and engaged dialogue with representatives of their constituencies. And we needed to acknowledge the variety of stakeholders and perspectives beyond the working group, including the ongoing tribal consultation, and that all these perspectives are considered by the department and the commission. So we we spoke about this earlier, so I think I'll just kind of briefly say no. We all understand that we may not be able to address everything that arises, but it is really important to put forth those areas that we do need to address, in the future, like with the management plan as we discussed. So, and that some of those items are more important or more pertinent for the management plan. So, but we had to consider how we can use the information we have now that is available to us and how we can move forward on these regulation review. So, we had approached the working group development to reach a consensus for the recommendations to put forth to the commission, but we realize that obviously not everyone is in agreement, and at this point, the regional approach that we talked about is what the department is proposing, as well as some other considerations that we're going to continue to discuss during this meeting that we haven't discussed yet. But we found that, we considered the input we received from the previous 3 meetings, and that while we don't all we don't all agree on how to address the issues, we do have a lot of agreements of some of the core issues. So I think an effort of time, I'm going to just kind of breeze through these, because this is just an overview of the document you have. It is not all encompassing, and you have that. So some of the areas of agreement, I believe we have the regional approach. So I know that I put on here that satellite imagery data is the best available data to determine status of a large spatial scale. I know you disagree with that, James. So
I didn't necessarily disagree. I just said if it's done correctly, that's all. If the pictures are taken at low tide, then they'll give a good data.
Okay.
If they're not, it won't. And it could just be it's a really short window that the pictures would be accurate. So anyway, that was the detail I pointed out.
Okay, thank you. I think we all agree that the bull kelp in Mendocino and Sonoma counties is impacted due to the marine heat wave and purple urchin increases, and that the cause is not due to commercial bull kelp harvest. Everyone supports a kelp restoration and management plan and adaptive management, and we all agree it's important to understand harvest impacts. So, next slide. And then, where we have some areas of divergence is the severity of kelp loss. So, some think that the current bull kelp loss along the North Coast is not unprecedented, and some think that it is, and it represents a catastrophic loss. And then there's some differences in how to handle the regulations. I'm going to just breeze through this. So then the next slide. So we also have some areas where we diverge in that, and it's, the level of protection to protect bull kelp. Some think that protecting the spores by prohibiting harvest is not needed, and some believe it is, to aid in recovery, and that many other fisheries do not allow harvest when there's a documented catastrophic loss. And instead of closure and limiting harvest, to not grant leases for a year, and also disagreement on the sunset date to complete the management plan. So we can go ahead to the next slide. And actually, no, we'll stop there. Does anyone want to talk about that areas of disagreement or agreement and divergence document before we move on?
I had a brief comment. When I believe I was when I disagreed that the bull kelp decline is not that it's unprecedented. It's definitely not unprecedented up in my harvest areas, and the data supports that. The data you have supports that. Mm-hmm. So that was where I disagreed. I don't know about Sonoma Mendocino because I haven't been watching it. That's all.
Okay, thank you. I see. Oh, Doug, you have your hand up too. I don't know if you had your hand up previously or.
That might have been from before. I didn't have my hand up, but I will comment briefly that I think there's a lot of nuance that's not captured in those areas of agreement and divergence. Like one of the things that we had that we've mentioned today is we do have pretty solid consensus on the need for a quantitative approach, and I didn't see that mentioned in the areas of agreement. and some of the elements of divergence are, you know, they're subtleties, and you know, we've all heard we've all learned a lot, I think, in this. I don't know, but yeah, it's hard to capture a lot in just 2 slides. I appreciate that.
Yeah, yeah. And it was also, you know, challenging to capture it on 2 pages. So, thank you. So if we can go on to the next slide. So we wanted to talk about harvest methods. So
Wait, Rebecca, really quick. I think Dr. Kubler had her hand up, possibly about the divergence section.
Thanks.
I
And
did,
to
just
let you guys know, I don't see everybody up on my screen, so I'm not ignoring you. So thanks for pointing that out, Gina.
Okay, it's just really quickly that that question about precedented or unprecedented, that is a quantitative question that's answered with that data. And the amount of canopy loss is precedented. It clearly has happened in the past. But the duration of that time when the canopy is very, very low or not measurable is longer than ever before. Right. So those are just, it's not a matter of opinion based on the data that's available. It is clearly precedented in scope, but not precedented in duration. That's all. Just geeking point.
Well, thank you.
Okay.
Does anyone else would like? Okay. So, so we wanted to talk about harvest methods now. So as far as currently allowed harvest methods for bull kelp, it can only be hand harvested. So for under the kelp regulations, because you know our regulations now have this kelp section and this edible seaweed section. So under the kelp regulations, it can only be cut. You can only cut attached kelp no more than 4 feet below the water surface at the time of cutting, and you can take drift or unattached kelp. For edible, under the edible seaweed regulations, you can take the entire individual, and drift unattached kelp is also okay to take. And also for the folks that do have a mechanical harvester, they have to stipulate in their kelp harvest plans how they will avoid bull kelp if those beds that they're harvesting have bull kelp in them. So, you know, so they are avoiding that. And so we can go to the next slide. So we, you know, we compiled some information here as far as like the actual current harvest methods that are used and this is for bull kelp only. So, you know, the department in 2019 had put forth a web-based survey for the commercial harvesters. And one of the question was, you know, how they are harvesting, you know, during an average year of harvest. So during an average year of harvest, most individuals that harvest bull kelp, they use like a boat. And I think when they mean boat, I think they mean boat or a kayak, using a knife or scissors to cut a portion of the individual kelp. So, so that was most of the folks that are harvesting. So here on the methods, we have some folks stated that they cut 1 or 2 feet below the nematocyst, or someone says they cut above the nematocyst. Some, you know, have different methods as far as like a lateral portion of the fronds above the nematocyst. So like either just part of the fronds, like half the fronds, or just all the fronds, you know, or fronds only. And then one person stated they cut like a foot above the nematocyst. So, and that was 5 folks that had provided that information. And then in the next slide, I spoke to some folks, the folks that I knew were commercially harvesting bull kelp. And so, and they provided with me some of the methods that they're harvesting. So again, cutting the stipe below the nematocyst and cutting the fronds approximately 1 foot away. And then there's just varying levels of how they harvest. But in general, most folks are harvesting some sort of portion of the blades. And we have a few folks that are harvesting, by taking, cutting it off below the bulb and, cutting the stipe. Do we have any questions on that? And I know, James, you could probably add to that as well as a commercial harvester of bulk kelp. So James, do you want to add anything to that?
Well, this looks pretty accurate. I mean, I know who each of these people are just by looking at these descriptions. It's kind of interesting. But at this point, I think this is good, what you have.
Okay, thanks. And so then unless there's any questions, does anyone else have any questions? Is anybody up? Hands up? Okay. So if we can go on to the next slide. So we wanted to talk about a harvest method to consider. So, there is not, as with bulk kelp, there's not much research on sustainable harvest methods. And this need to have more research on sustainable harvest methods has been identified in the enhanced status report when that comes out. So, we do recognize that with the current regulations that allow, the take of the stipe, that, it can happen, you can wipe out a bulk kelp stand with those current regulations. And we acknowledge, as clearly shown on the previous 2 slides, that, we acknowledge that most of the harvesters aren't even using our current regulations. Most of them are cutting, parts of the blades in some fashion or another. And again, we all know that the current bulk kelp loss is not due to harvest. We only have 2 harvesters that cut below the bulb. And if we propose, if we move forward with this proposed recommendation of harvest methods, it would require them to change their methods. So we wanted to consider a statewide harvest methods, and this is for areas where harvest would be allowed, of cutting the blade about 1 foot above the nematocyst. So this would allow for that individual to continue producing spores, although it's going to be at a reduced rate. There is an acknowledgement for those harvesters that currently take the stipes. It might result in more blades being taken because, stipes are obviously heavier than the blades, and we have that ton limit. It would still be okay to take detached drift individuals, although including the stipe, but we do need to follow up with our law enforcement folks on that. And this would be like a more precautionary approach than the current allowed harvest method. So this regulation wouldn't have a sunset date, but it may change upon additional research on sustainable harvest methods, and I fully expect it probably would, and unless the kelp restoration and management plan determines otherwise. So that's our thoughts on that. So I wanted to hear what everyone on the call would thinks about those proposed methods of harvest. And I see James has his hand up.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so I mean, I harvest. I'm one of the people that harvest all the fronds cut about 1 foot out from the blade or from the bulb, the nematocyst, and I harvest pretty much exclusively, at least in more recent years, just the overwintered plants. Like I'm going to be going out for my first harvest here, hopefully, in a week or so, and so basically, all I have any use for is the fronds because we're drying them and selling them as like that. human consumption. However, I do recognize, based on my own observations as well as the research, in the letter that I sent around to the Bull Kelp Working Group members, I attached the Roland study, and they looked at the regrowth, the rates of regrowth after cutting, and I believe that was mostly done in the like summer or fall. But I can tell you that when I harvest these overwintered plants in the spring, I mean, they might grow out a foot or two before they die from the summer warm water. So it really, in terms of reproduction, probably makes no difference whatsoever how I were to harvest a given biomass from an area when we're talking overwintered. When we're talking about harvesting in the fall, it's also probably almost the same, because the plants pretty much stop growing or very much slow down as the light levels diminish after October, November. And so I really would, although this is not my own personal interest, because I have no interest in the bulbs, I really don't see the point in trying to limit it that way. I do know that for that people are harvesting a lot of bull kelp for their abalone. Art told me that when he's harvesting it for his abalone, it can be pretty rough out there harvesting out there. He's got to harvest every week, and it's much faster to harvest if you can just grab that stipe and cut it rather than messing around with the fronds. Like, because it's kind of a safety and convenience kind of an issue for him. Approximately 2/3 of the weight of a bull kelp is the fronds, just so you know. And so anyway, I just also know that the original edible bull kelp harvest was for making bull kelp pickles back 50 years ago or longer. And there was actually a business in Fort Bragg that was making kelp pickles until just not too many years ago. And so I don't really, if there's an abundance of bull kelp, and if someone's allowed to take 4,000 pounds, there'd be I can imagine very few instances where it would really make that much difference, assuming the person's doing some kind of what do you want to call it, selective take. So say maybe 1 out of 4 plants, it becomes a moot point. That's all.
Okay.
I'll just one more thing. The Roland study basically showed that once you cut the fronds, you've cut off most of the plant's photosynthesis. So the regrowth is very slow, and it takes quite a while before they start producing sori, and they produce them at a much slower rate. And that was more like that during the higher light times, during the winter, like the late fall and winter, and probably even into the spring. I don't know that it makes a whole lot of difference, because there's not really that much regrowth or production of sori after cutting the fronds. That's all.
Did anyone else have their want to speak?
Yeah, I have my hand up. This is Doug. I speak on behalf of Art. Something that's not captured in this proposal is the fact that if the driver here is spore production, it overlaps with an existing regulation that's not included here, in that Art is restricted seasonally on when he's allowed to harvest bull kelp. There's a seasonal window where he is not allowed to harvest for the sole purpose of retaining spore production, and that's I don't know if that's true for the other whole plant harvester, but by doing it this way, you'd create a redundancy on that. I agree with James. I don't see that if the quantitative management on tonnage is the clean and direct way to do it. I don't think that there's anything to be gained by trying to parse out a harvest method. Art is already constrained. And I don't know, James, maybe you know who the other whole plant harvester is, but there is a great deal of nutritional value in the stipe and pneumaticist for abalone forage. And he would not be in support of that. It's much more efficient and much safer for him to, from a material handling perspective, to go out with the skiff and pull the whole plant up, cut it off once, and then stack them in the boat that way. I asked him a directed question on how he felt about frond only harvest, and he specifically said that it would triple the labor effort of the harvesting process.
Thank you, Doug. And yes, thank you for clarifying. Yes, so yes, the art is he harvests within the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and there is that seasonal closure between April 1st and July 31st of each year. So unless you have at least kelp bed within that sanctuary boundaries, you can't harvest full kelp. You can take it if it's beached. But that is currently, that's the only location in California that has a seasonal closure.
But it represents a pretty big piece of ocean, the Monterey Bay
Yeah.
National Marine Sanctuary.
Yeah,
And that also, if going down this pathway, there's also a large number of no-take reserves in the Monterey Peninsula area. So looking at this on a tonnage basis for harvestable areas is a much cleaner and more direct way to go about this than trying to parse it out in separate categories by harvest method, in my opinion.
There's one other little point I wanted to make, and it's kind of a enforcement aspect. If it's fronds only, I know that Art down there, he harvests a lot of drift kelp, and so if he's only allowed to harvest the fronds, he's passing up on harvesting big floating areas of drifting kelp, that it makes no sense to make him only harvest attached plants.
Yeah, so that's why we did, because I know I spoke to Art about it. It's not recently, but when we were talking about potential harvest methods quite some time ago. And I know that he does utilize drift kelp. And so that's why one of the things that we would put forth would be to take detached drift individuals would be okay. However, we do recognize that, we need to talk to our law enforcement because to see if that would be a challenge to allow, to have the specific harvest methods, but still allow drift kelp, which would obviously, include the stipes as well. So that's a really good point. Did anyone else have their hand up or want to speak to potential harvest methods? I'd be interested in hearing from other folks. Oh, I see Dr. Kupler. Okay.
Hi. I think based on the biology of the plants and the fact that the spores are produced fairly far out on the fronds, I suspect it would be more sustainable to harvest half the fronds instead of all the fronds a foot out. But given that at this time we have no evidence that any harvesting affects the population size, maybe this is something that can go down the road, right? That consideration of harvest methods could be something that is based on actually doing some experiments and measuring the effects, and that it's not a make or break thing at this time, that it could wait for the management plan and maybe some additional experiments about the actual effects of harvest methods on spore production. That's my comment.
Yeah, there is very limited research on this. You know, and some of the research states that it does, you know, affect spore production, but it's and obviously biomass, but it is very limited research, and it's definitely a need. It's one of those research needs of the many research needs for bulk kelp.
Yes.
So, did you have your hand up again, James, or is that from previous?
Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, thanks, Janet, for that clarification, and I agree. That I just wanted to point out that for edible harvest, the post-SORI material is worthless. It's tattered. There's nothing left to it. All the nutrition went into the SORI and drifted away. That's all.
Thank you. And Cindy?
Yeah, I just wanted to concur that I really feel like harvest methods could probably be something that get pushed out as part of the regulation process for the fisheries management plan. As somebody who has harvested to feed abalone before, it really would make a huge difference, as Art points out, in their labor costs. And if we don't have definitive information about, you know, SORI regrowth and that kind of thing, I just feel like it's really a little bit premature to change things up. You know, if we're going to be being precautionary, we should be being precautionary on the total take. Just would be my recommendation as we've been discussing. Thanks.
So, so yes, thank you for that, Cindy. So, so with current regulations, you know, edible seaweed harvesters can take up to 2 tons per for a license a year. And then under the kelp regulations, that there's no like limit on that amount currently that can be taken. So just wanted to point that out. Is there any other questions before we move on to the next slide? Comments? No? Okay. All right. So if we can go on to the next slide. So harvest logs. So both harvesters, at least all the harvesters I've spoke to on this matter, and the department are interested in online reporting. So we've spoke to the department staff who's in charge of online reporting, and their time is very limited right now. So unfortunately, this is not something that we can make happen in the near future. But we recognize the need and we completely agree with the need. And so we will continue to consider options on how we can do electronic reporting for harvest logs. So when the department staff in the future have the bandwidth to tackle that, we'll be ready to move forward on that. So, and then, so in light of that, you know, we're stuck with these paper logs. And so we are looking to do an overhaul of those paper logs. And some of that would be just cleanup. And there's a lot of cleanup that we could do on those. We've already identified quite a bit of areas to clean up. But some of the things we wanted to discuss is, so current harvest logs for kelp and edible seaweed logs, so they're reported differently as far as locations. So kelp logs they provide this administrative kelp bed number, which is a number that, you know, it's within regulation. It's a, you know, we know this administrative kelp bed is within these boundaries and such. And then the edible seaweed logs report their harvest by a fishing block number and the nearest prominent landmark. So one of the proposed changes that we are interested in is requiring all harvesters to also provide the location of their harvest with latitude and longitude coordinates. So this would allow for us in the department to have greater understanding of harvest location. And it's going to improve the ability to assess if harvest is, sustainability in that area. But this would apply to all harvest logs. And currently they're considered edible harvest logs and kelp harvest logs. And then also we're proposing to include the number of harvesters or number of individuals harvesting. So with the current licenses, they allow for an unlimited number of individuals to harvest for the business. There is no limit. This business can only have 5 people or whatever. There is an unlimited number. So we don't know how many people are harvesting under a single business license. So if we have that number on a monthly harvest log, then the intention was to allow for us to have a better understanding of the overall effort on a monthly basis. And this would also help us know the total number of harvesters in an industry when we move on to considering royalty fees and license considerations. And then again, we were also considering, there's going to be a lot of cleanup right now with the current harvest logs. There's this triplicate requirement that is no longer needed. And then, so that was both the kelp and edible seaweed harvest logs. And then if you consider just the kelp logs, there are currently 2 pages. We're going to try to combine those to 1 page. It's going to be really hard because we're already trying to do that. But we're going to try to combine it to 1 page. We'll see what we can do. If not, we can still do some cleanup and moving things around. One of the things we would like to have is to differentiate on those kelp logs how much of that harvest is giant kelp and bull kelp. So we don't currently know how much is, when we get a kelp log, it just has an amount. We know primarily it's giant, but there is some bull kelp take. And so if we have that kind of information, we can use it towards management more effectively. The edible seaweed harvest logs have to report their harvest by either a common name or species name. So we know how much bull kelp is being taken under the edible seaweed, but we have no idea under those kelp logs. So, and we did want to acknowledge that that again, and I mentioned this previously, that current regulations for harvest plans for mechanical harvesters do detail how they are going to avoid harvest of bull kelp from portions of the blades that contain both giant and bull kelp. So we do have to acknowledge there may be some incidental catch of bull kelp with mechanical take, but they are to avoid bull kelp. And I know from talking, I believe, to you, Doug, perhaps to Art as well, that if you have a mechanical harvester, you do not want to go into a bull kelp bed because that will cause some damage to your harvester. So, and then also just some general cleanup of that kelp log as well. So we wanted to hear what your thoughts are on those proposed changes, the latitude, longitude coordinates, the number of harvesters individuals harvesting on a monthly basis, and differentiating between giant and bull kelp on the kelp log.
General comments in response to your slide. With Ab Farm no longer operating, they would be the only mechanical harvester that would have harvested both. Our harvest of bull kelp is 0, even incidental, it's 0. You don't get bull kelp south of Point Conception. If I think it would be very easy for Art to segregate his bull kelp from giant kelp. I wouldn't have any problem with that. I doubt Art would have any problem with it. That would just get better data for you. I think the lat long thing is a little bit it's a little bit odd if you're telling us that department doesn't have the staff to generate an online macro for reporting, that you're going to have the ability to do anything with lat long data analysis. I think that's sort of two weird sides of the same statement. I don't see that adds anything. If I'm not going to go to the mat over it, but I doubt that that's going to improve the. It sounds like it's more about the edible than the kelp harvesting. I think that my guess is that the geographic fidelity on kelp harvesting is fine from the AKB numbers, and that you're looking for improved geographical fidelity for the edibles. I don't know if you're actually going to be able to do anything with lat long data, but to me that sounds superfluous. And the rest of the kelp log and the licensing stuff, I mean, I agree. That's none of this stuff I would imagine is particularly controversial in this group setting. But yeah, for example, like the kelp harvesting license, we have to ask for it with a phone call at the Los Alamitos branch every December. And there's like a 2-week window where we hopefully get the application in time so that we can start cutting on January 1st. And the license application asks for my eye and hair color. It's not really designed for a business. It's not, every time I do kelp licensing or kelp harvest reporting, I feel like I'm taking a field trip to the 1950s. It could use an update all around. But yeah, I mean, everybody knows that. That's not a secret.
Thanks, Doug. James?
Yeah, no, most of this seems fairly, reasonable. As far as latitude, longitude coordinates for what I do, I mean, I could see how that could help with enforcement and checking on what people are doing. But I don't currently have a device for that. I mean, I guess you can get a device for doing that. Other than that, I just just some of the things that we talked about the other day, just simple regulatory cleanup that makes it work better for everybody. So that's all.
Okay. Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add to that discussion? Okay, so if we can move on to the next slide, please. So as Doug led into kelp harvester's license. So Doug and I have had many conversations on this, I think, as well as others. But so yes, obviously there is a desire to have online license sales. As Doug stated, it's kind of a hassle in the way it's done in this matter. So it's something we're looking into to see if we can make it happen. So even though, unfortunately we can't have online reporting now for harvest logs, maybe we can have the licenses to have the ability to purchase that online. And I totally understand what you're saying, Doug. You have a short time frame to get your license so you can start harvesting because, obviously you need to feed the abalone year round. So we're trying to make that happen. As far as another item that we have identified for the license, one of the things we are going to move forward with is including a drying permit option. So I know we spoke about this quite some time ago on the webinars. So so for some of you, this isn't new information, but we have, so there is, in our Fish and Game Code, there is this requirement of having, it's called a kelp drying permit. It's not needed anymore. It's one of those regulations that's not needed. So what we're trying to do is, excuse me, I'm sorry. What we're proposing to do is, in order to meet statutory compliance, is to, on the regular kelp harvesting license, we'll just have this little checkbox there that states, like, if you're going to dry your harvest, check here, and that will constitute also as your drying permit. So we will be able to meet statutory compliance. There isn't going to be an additional cost to harvesters. There's not going to be any additional paperwork. It's just a simple way of meeting that compliance issue.
Is that drying of any kind, or just that agar stuff? Just drying of any kind?
Well, it's called a kelp drying permit. So I think the intent is that, and I know kelp, if you look at our regulations, kelp is pretty much all marine algae in code. So I think the intent is for it to be all marine algae. So yeah, so it's just one of those old regulations that is no longer needed. So does anyone have any feedback that they want to provide on the license? I know, Doug, you were talking about the eye color, hair color. I'll look into that. I don't know, honestly, I don't know how other commercial licenses are, how they operate, but I can look into that, see if that's something that is
It's not something I lose any sleep over, but it does occasionally create issues with, I'm trying to think in terms of like clarification for example, enforcement, right? If my kelp harvesting boat is operating and one of the wardens approaches it, and it's not necessarily clear from a warden to for a conversation that I've had with the warden, whether, for example, my kelp boat captain needs to have a commercial fishing license. Mine happens to have one unrelated to my business, but it's not, there's some items of clarification on how kelp harvesting is licensed. And like, we have a commercial vessel registration for our boat, but do the crew need to have commercial fishing licenses? I think the answer is no, but there's nowhere in the regs that you can point to that says it. And so I've had conversations with enforcement that have kind of gone around in circles for a while. So those are the sorts of, I'm not trying to, I'm using the hair color thing just anecdotally to point it out in a larger sense, that it has existed for a long time in this sort of special side category. And there are some ways that manifests when you're having, for example, a conversation with enforcement. And that's all I think this is a highly granular and pedantic sort of top set of this regs discussion that I think I'd be happy to take offline with you or any other members of staff, that we could kind of go through and just, I don't think anything that we'd come up with would be controversial. So rather than, but I'd be happy to help collaborate on it.
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, my understanding is that a commercial fishing license is not required for a commercial kelp harvesting license. So, or to commercially harvest kelp. So you're right. It's a little bit different than all the other fisheries.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the answer. But what I'm saying is, like, when you're having that conversation with enforcement, there's nowhere where you can go and just say and point to it and say, here we are, case closed, end of discussion. So anyway.
Thank you. Is it any other feedback on this license topic from folks? No. Okay. So we can move on. So it's 3:13. We are going to keep going until 4, but do folks want to take a quick break, a 5 or a 10-minute break at this point?
That's probably a good idea.
Okay, sounds great. So let's take a, what's your vote? Since you piped up, Susan, what do you think, 5 or 10 minutes?
Can't we vote between 3 and 5? Just everyone. I think we can do a quick 5-minute break.
5 minutes.
I'm taking myself off mute just to chuckle at your joke, Susan.
Thank you very much.
5 minutes, fine with everybody else. I'm going for 5.
Yep, let's do 5.
Okay, cool. Okay, We'll see you back at, let's make it even. Let's say 3:20. We'll go 6 minutes. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, it's 3:20. Folks, I'll wait to see. I see some folks may not be back yet, so I'll wait a minute or two. All right. I'm not sure if we have everyone back on. Maybe if you can, I don't know, if folks, maybe if I see a couple of more cameras come up, then some videos, then I'll know folks are back on, because I know a few of us have our videos on.
We could use the chat too. People just want to say, yes, I'm here in the chat. That
Oh,
will let us know you're here.
that sounds
Or
great.
video.
Good idea. Okay. Though, see. Put the chat here. Okay, great. So let's go ahead and start. Looks like we have a few folks. So, let me hide my meeting chat here. Okay, so we, as was brought forth, the Intertribal Sinkyone Wilderness Council did post a proposal on marine algae on their webpage. So the proposal does have a lot of different aspects on it. And I know that the working group members wanted to comment on that. So, there was a little bit of confusion, so we weren't able to have a representative from the tribes to be on the call today. But, the department is not going to present the proposal. It's not our proposal to present, but we wanted to have this time available to you so you can provide feedback or any questions that you may have, and we can relay it to the tribes on your behalf. So I sent, well, I know that Cindy had already sent a link to the proposal, and then there was a link to the proposal in the agenda. So I'm hoping folks had a chance to look at that. And again, we just want to hear your feedback on the bull kelp portion of the proposal only. So if there's something in particular you would like us to share with the tribes, any questions, any comments, feel free to let us know now and we can provide that.
My feedback is very, very simple and straightforward. The memo proposal that I read presents commercial seaweed harvesting as an activity which is incompatible with sustainable management of a resource. And I would like to go on the record and state that every seaweed harvester I know is highly engaged in promoting the sustainable use of the resource, and that I would welcome a collaborative discussion of ways that that could be made better with any stakeholder, including any member of the tribal community.
Okay, thank you, Doug. Does anyone else want to comment or have questions on the document that you would like us to put forth to the tribes?
Yeah, I mean, I basically, I would echo Doug's comments that I feel like that we share, as far as the resource, we share the same concerns, and I really don't understand the conflict that's being proposed, if you know what I'm saying. Perhaps there has been something that has happened in the past that some kind of someone was disrespectful to some native people somewhere. I mean, I hear rumors about someone said something to somebody and someone was offended, or, you know, I mean, but I would like to find out what that was, if something like that, and find out if there's a way to remedy the situation. If someone offended someone, or someone harvested in someone else's territory, you know, stepped on some toes that way, some kind of way that caused this kind of a reaction. I'd like to know what it was about and what can be done to remedy the situation.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone else want to provide any feedback or questions that we can relay to the tribal representatives? Okay, so we'll go ahead and continue on. So now we wanted to, again, this is wrapping up our last meeting. So, you know, we're going to be considering, you know, the feedback from you, feedback from the tribes, all other interested stakeholders, as we continue to develop this proposed regulatory amendment. So as it was stated earlier, the department provides the proposal to the commission, and the commission makes that decision on how they want to move forward. So we, you know, again, we realize that not everyone is in agreement. At this point, you know, the approach that we discussed today is what we're proposing for regulation changes that would go to the commission. You know, there were some really good points brought up on like harvest logs and the licenses. You know, there's some things that we need to continue to look into as well, and I recognize that. And, you know, we still, you know, even today, you know, I heard a lot of areas of agreement, and, you know, and of course we have areas where we don't agree on, but I feel like we've learned a lot from this process. So I really appreciate that. And we do want to talk about the anticipated timeline. So this is where we'll go into some more detail on that. And then we have some time after this. So we're going to go ahead and continue on and look at that harvest, the kelp canopy data that Gina put together of the satellite imagery. So, but before we move into that, I just wanted to say that, you know, right now the anticipated timeline for the regulation review is the department would make a recommendation to the MRC in July, and then the MRC will make a recommendation to the commission in August and potentially move forward with a formal regulation review. And then that would be a tentative notice in October at the commission meeting, and then a discussion and potential adoption during December. And again, as Kirsten and Susan stated, you know, there are things that may change that process, you know, whatever, you know, the commission comes back with. And there's, again, more opportunity to provide input during those processes as well. And this isn't, you know, we are still going to be working on kelp restoration and management plan, and we welcome everybody, everybody's involvement in that management plan. So this is not the end of involvement. So maybe if did anyone have any questions on that before we go on to the to looking at that satellite imagery data?
One simple question: when is the MRC meeting? Is it scheduled?
It's scheduled for July. Yeah, it would be.
Is there a date set?
Oh yes.
It's July 21st.
Okay. Thank you.
So maybe Gina, if you don't mind, going on to that 2 slides down with the latest kelp canopy data that you compiled for the group. So this is, do you, Gina, you put this together. So do you want to discuss the data set?
Yeah, so this is, we basically just updated the figures that we presented before. So this is like the same format we started with Central and South, I guess, before when we showed this. And this isn't our focus, so I'm just gonna move on to North. That's okay, once I find my mouse. So the North here is mostly showing bull kelp. Let's see, we defined North as Oregon, California border to San Francisco Bay. So that's the region. So this is the kelp canopy cover within all administrative kelp beds from that region, Oregon to San Francisco Bay. And so we got year on the x-axis and then maxed canopy area in square kilometers on the y-axis. And by maxed canopy area, we mean of the 4 quarters, the quarter that showed the maximum for that year. So that's what the points are. And so we have the data updated through the last quarter of 2020 now. They've also made other updates to the data set. So basically they refined the kelp detection algorithm that they were using. The way that it distinguishes between land and water needed some updating. So they made it better, basically. So it's detecting kelp better. So this probably looks different even in past years than what you had before. And that's why. And so just looking over, we're probably all interested in the right side. It looks like 2020 is a little bit higher than 2019. But the average after 2014 is still 95% lower than the average like 7 years before 2014. But some sites, people have noticed some sites looking like they have a lot of kelp recently, and this is showing a slight uptick from 2019 for that whole region. And then next we can show you the per county figures, unless anyone has questions or comments on this North region figure. Okay. So now we have, oh, Cindy, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I just had a quick question, Gina. I was just wondering, like, generally speaking, are you seeing a trend on what quarter you're seeing the kelp maximum north of San Francisco Bay, or is it like highly variable by county, like say over the last 10 years? Is there like a general trend of the maximum?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I think it's usually summer, but
Okay.
I don't know for sure. I don't quite remember. I did look at that.
Okay.
So I'm not totally sure. But if you want to follow up with me in an email, I can let you know.
I will. Thanks.
James.
Yes. Yeah, I have a question. So the do you? I don't know how much you're involved in the actual choosing of the satellite images and so on, but are they all taken at low tide? Like,
I don't know off the top of my head. I can pull up their methodology.
and that doesn't necessarily have to be something you have to answer right now, but it was my question because I know that first of all, that like 2 to 3 hours before low tide, the tidal currents pull all the bull kelp underwater around Crescent City.
Yeah,
So
they do.
in a 2-hour stretch, you could go from no bull kelp to bull kelp everywhere as far as a satellite imagery would go. And so I was just curious because from 2019 to 2020, I saw a great increase in the amount of bull kelp in the area fronting Crescent City, which is pretty much all the bull kelp in Del Norte County. And so I'm not seeing that in the graph, and it just seems strange.
Yeah, this is their methods I pulled off the website. I'm trying to see if it says anything about tides. I don't think it does. I know that they're definitely aware of the influence of tides, but I don't know how they dealt with it specifically.
Because typically, there's a 3-hour window when the bull kelp's visible, I guess you would say. Maybe 4, depends on the tide, but
I'm
If you
gonna
don't
guess
catch it-
that they aimed for low tide only. But again, if you want to follow up with me after, like in an email or check, I don't know if we've provided any literature on this before. You can follow up with me and we can look into it in more detail.
Okay, because just by my own estimates, there is several thousand times more in 2020 than 2019. Because there was like, I could count the bull kelps on my fingers that I saw anywhere of overwintered bull kelps in the spring of 2020.
And you're talking about in Del Norte County?
Correct.
Yeah, so yeah, that's not reflected in this county figure either. It's showing maybe slightly less in
Right.
2020.
So that makes me wonder, like, did they
Okay.
get the timing right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I can specifically ask the person who deals with reading the satellite images, like what's going on with 2020. It seems like there should be more because I've asked him those questions before. There was like an outlier in Humboldt County in 1999 or something. It was like 20 times greater than all the other points. And I was like, what's up with that? And he said, oh, that was an error. We corrected everything. And then they used that information to like not overhaul, but just update the whole data set. So I can also follow up with you on that.
Okay, well, thanks.
And I did see when you had the methods up, Gina, that it operates like on a 16-day time window. So it looked like images are taken every 16 days. But yeah, that's a good point about, the effect of tides, because Gina stated that, those researchers are very aware of the constraints of the data set they're dealing with. So.
Okay, so maybe you'll just talk a little bit here about Del Norte County and Humboldt County. I mean, it doesn't look as there's no drastic decline like we saw overall on the North Coast. So the pattern here is different than North Coast overall. It looks like it in Del Norte was pretty high in 2018. If this is taking tides into account, et cetera, and then dropped down, and then 2020 didn't look like it improved much, but maybe there's something they're missing. So this is sort of like an overview from the satellites. But yeah, it doesn't. I don't see a trend here, but I didn't do any stats on this. It looks potentially pretty normal, and similar perhaps in Humboldt County. Interestingly, it looks like it was really low in the 90s, which looks concerning, but it came back and bouncing around again. So that's what we have for the update through 2020. Any other comments on this? So then we also have Mendocino and Sonoma counties, which have a lot more kelp in general, and these are driving the regional North Coast trend. So we do see that larger decline starting in 2014, and it stays below 0.5, probably below 0.2 for both of these regions. Sonoma has less than Mendocino overall. Yeah, and it's hard to tell if it's recovering yet. If we want to define recovery as like approaching the 34-year average, I'd say it's definitely not approaching that average. So yeah, that's what we have for 2020.
Hey Gina, this is Doug.
Yeah.
Do you have the hard, like this is just a curiosity. It's so compressed there. It's so close to close to zero on Sonoma and Mendocino. What is the actual number for either of those, like the square kilometers?
I don't know that off the top of my head, but I can obviously pull that up at some point.
If you don't have it easily, I just was noting that, on Sonoma, right, your bottom is 0.3 kilometers.
Yeah.
Right. And on Del Norte and Humboldt, it was 0.003 kilometers.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you got two orders of magnitude difference in area, right? So again, just I know I sound like I'm beating a dead horse, but like, what is that in tonnage? And so like if we're supporting 4,000 pounds of take in Del Norte with whatever 0.003, I'm just kind of curious what those raw numbers actually look like in Mendocino and Sonoma. You know, like does you know there's I think it works out to like 0.003 is what 3,000 square meters. You know, so it's just again just the thing that I want to be remembered for in my participation of this work group is encouraging you know, some of these quantitative coefficients so that we can actually take this and use it for tonnage take modeling, right? Like what's the right amount? What's the number of pounds that we can safely take, right? And so how, you know, and trying to figure out what the coefficient is for pounds per, you know, 1,000 square meters or pounds per square kilometer, tons per square kilometer, or whatever we want to use, doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'd have to open up another program and look through code in order to get the number for you right now. So unless I start talking about something else, then I can go do that.
But we're talking about we're talking about two harvesters in the north region, and there are two or so, 3 harvesters in this region which we're proposing to be closed. But there's a 2 order of magnitude difference in square area on the y-axis, and what does that translate to in terms of tonnage?
We could compare those actual numbers per county. And it's
interesting. The geology of these coastal zones is different. You know, the restructure in these zones are different. There's a lot of variables, obviously. But clearly, like historically, you know, you're looking at peak years in Sonoma and in excess of 1 million square meters of kelp. And 1 million square meters of kelp in Mendocino isn't even really that impressive of a peak year. So the raw numbers of actual biomass are what we want to essentially distill this toward. Yeah,
and folks are still working on that area to biomass conversion, but it is not done yet. But hopefully
right.
soon.
And then, you know, the logical extension of that is, so what do you know, what's the goal? Like James's question earlier about like, well, what is recovery? You know, the 3 to 5 year, you know, if the department ends up proposing to the MRC that Mendocino and Sonoma should be closed, and I don't agree that 3 to 5 years is the horizon. I think it should be a year-to-year basis. But like, what's the trigger? What's the area, or what's the tonnage trigger that those need to hit in order to say, okay, you can open bulk kelp harvesting in Mendocino and Sonoma County again? That's the end product that so far I think is missing from our discussion and a report that would be advanced to the MRC. I think that has to be, and if we don't have the number, there has to be a discussion of how we get the number and what, you know, that has to be included. When is it okay, and how do we know, and how much can we take?
Yeah, and those are important distinctions and things that will be looked at when we go into the management plan. So, but it's important that we need to make sure that we are clear of what we don't know.
We do have this data for Marin County now because they improved the satellite detection. Do we want to talk about Marin, or should we wrap up?
Oh, well, we have it, so let's
Sure.
Yeah, let's have a look.
it,
Yeah.
and then-
So previously, the satellites detected virtually nothing in Marin County, but now they can detect 0.00 whatever 1, I guess. So they really improved their detection program, however that exactly works. So there's much less in Marin than most of the other counties in the North Coast, but it doesn't look like there's any sort of dramatic decline in recent years.
Right. So is there much, I'm sorry, is there much giant kelp there?
I don't
No.
actually know.
It would be, it's bull kelp.
Okay.
I
Okay.
don't know, it's, from what I understand, it's all bull kelp, and perhaps maybe some giant, but I understand bull kelp being there.
Yeah. Okay. It's just amazing because, you know, in Del Norte, Humboldt, Mendocino, Sonoma, 2019 was the bottom of the
Yeah.
of it all. And look at this. It's like the almost the opposite. 2018 was like a phenomenal year in Del Norte. 2019 was nothing.
Yeah,
Anyway.
different.
And these are sort of in the same general realm as the Del Norte areas, are they not?
Yeah, I think Del Norte was 0.0. Yeah, it just goes up a little bit higher from like the 1999 big point, but yeah, 0.012, 0.0.
There's a lot of sandy shore in Marin County. There's not as much rocky reef in Marin as there is in Sonoma.
Yeah, I think maybe what part of the problem was why they weren't detecting this before was it's more patchy, and the satellites had a harder time, or the program they used to read the imagery had a harder time picking out the really small patches. And then they improved that, so that's why they can now detect it here.
I wonder if this includes the Farallones. Is that Marin?
Whatever's in the administrative
Technically?
kelp.
Okay.
Okay.
It's kind of encouraging, Marin. You know, it shows a resilience. Oh.
Yeah.
So Marin, historically, we haven't had, at least from our records, harvest in Marin County.
Would this, Rebecca, change your thinking on the suspension of on the inclusion of Marin in the closure, in the proposed closure, since it's showing that it is not under what would be viewed as a prolonged down year scenario?
Right. At this time, no, it would not, because that county has historically never been harvested. So, we may need to consider that more, but from my understanding at this time, we wouldn't be proposing a change on the Marin aspect.
Even though it's showing biomass at the same scale of square kilometers that Del Norte is showing.
Yeah, you have a very good point. We can talk about it some more and further consider it, because we did just get this data set, because you do have a good point. So it's just something we'll need to think about further.
What do I have next? Yeah, and then we just have leftovers from our previous meetings after this. So I think that's all we had to discuss on here. Is that right, Rebecca?
Yep, the other was just the previous data sets that you'd provided. So with that, that's going to end our meeting. I'm glad we had time for Gina to provide the data that she's compiled, so we can all see that updated data. So again, we really appreciate everybody, you all taking the time to share your knowledge and being part of this process. And the meetings with the commission and the management plan, will continue to provide opportunities for everyone to provide their expertise. So we really hope that you could all be involved in that. And thank you very much. I appreciate this. Learned a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. It has really been informative.
For sure. Thank you. Okay. Have a great day.
Yeah, thank you all as well. Appreciate this opportunity to talk about all this. So thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, and I look forward for all of those of you that can participate in the MRC meeting discussion. That'll be great. We'll try to make it early enough in the meeting so you don't have to wait all day for the discussion.
Thank you, Susan.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.